I'm making a guess here, and the guess is that I am a part of the majority in this congregation this morning. The majority who muddle through life, scraping through from one deadline to the next, procrastinating as often as possible, believing that just in time is a suitable way to live one's life. Someday we'll take a poll to see if that's really true or not. But I certainly believe that's a description of my life. Procrastinating as much as possible, believing just in time is a suitable way to make your way from one day to the next. You see, when I first retired a few years ago, I was convinced I would explore our family trees. Genealogy. My German relatives, Pat's German and Dutch relatives, I knew there were stories back there, important stories that we didn't know yet, and that we would be the wiser and the better if we got to know them. I really do believe that the ancestors are always around us, still with us, influencing us even now, and learning their stories will certainly enrich the telling of our own stories. Genetic history is an important thing to be aware of as well, from the color of our eyes to hair characteristics, things we can learn about our medical backgrounds, artistic and musical aptitudes, and so on. But I believe that as important as our individual family trees and their stories may be, this morning I'd like to focus on a broader, wider story. It's the good news story, one that has gathered all of our individual stories together into a more grander expression of what it means to be a human and what it means to be alive as one of God's children. From the great diversity that is represented in us even now, we have been woven into an amazing faith story, and that really is our distinctive identity. In a very real way, our faith story begins with Jesus of Nazareth, although the antecedents go back all the way to the beginning of time. But the faith story I'm talking about starts with Jesus of Nazareth, who came from a peasant family, single-parent family as well, emerging as this charismatic teacher and healer who challenged the religious authorities of his time and the Roman occupiers of his land. Like many other charismatic leaders who challenged the status quo and the powers that be, he was at first seen as a nuisance, and then as a threat, and finally someone who needed to be put to death to silence not only his voice, but the memory of his followers. Those followers proved to be a stubborn lot, certainly underqualified to carry on the message of Jesus, a message of God's love for all of God's children. Most of those early folk could not read or write. They were uneducated folks. And over a period of time, they were transformed from a silent group content to talk about the ways life used to be with Jesus to a cadre of missionary people who said, we've got good news to tell, and we are the very ones to tell the story of Jesus. From the occupied Holy Land of Jerusalem and its surroundings, they moved west into Asia Minor and finally into Europe. They also moved east into India, and they moved south into Africa, telling this good news story about a loving, forgiving, accepting God. So picture a settlement of people in North Africa on the southern shores of the Mediterranean Sea. And in that community, there are a diversity of religious expressions, all kinds, a variety of religious beliefs in spirits, in forces, in idols, in gods. Religion is often used to make sense of a world filled with mystery and unexplained events. And so those people had come to worship a number of gods that they thought were influential in their lives, trying to find favor for themselves and their families, trying to provide healthy crops and herds, survival being their journey from day to day. Somewhere along the line, a Christian missionary came to this settlement. A missionary speaking of a new way of understanding life. The missionary talked not about a lot of gods, but a single God. A God taught to that missionary in the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, seeking to establish love as God's central identity. Love, God's central identity, not power, not fear, not intimidation, but love. A genuine feeling of love and compassion for the other person. And so the missionary talks about a new way of organizing human communities beyond race and color, inclusive of all, as God is a God who is inclusive of all. And as touched as those people in that settlement might have been by what that missionary said about God, they were even more moved by what that person did as that person lived among them. For the missionary was that living embodiment of a caring and forgiving and loving God. We do not know the name of that missionary. We do know that that settlement in North Africa was the remnant of the once mighty city of Carthage that vied with Rome over a period of time for dominance in the Mediterranean. And we also know that soon after that missionary died, Augustine was born in that community. Saint Augustine, the great theologian of the Christian church. And Augustine became the leader of the church thanks to that nameless missionary who brought the good news of Jesus Christ to that small settlement and convinced Augustine's mother and Augustine to follow this Jesus. A critical piece of our good news story. We, in this year of 2017, are remembering 500 years ago to 1517 and the Protestant Reformation. And maybe you've heard all you care to know about Martin Luther and Ulrich Zwingli and Philip Melanchthon and John Calvin and John Knox and the other major Protestant reformers of the early 1500s. Not to be forgotten are those who were ahead of those reformers, those who also challenged the ruling church authorities, and they usually suffered dire consequences. People like John Huss and William Tyndale, they did not die in their own beds. They were tortured to the end because the church didn't like dissenting voices. Now, when you look back at some of those people, none of our spiritual ancestors, the main characters of the good news story, were perfect examples of godliness. None of them. Everyone we could mention, from Augustine to Luther and others like them, were this combination of saint and skunk. Kind of like us. Combination of saint and skunk with endearing qualities and painful failings. We need to admire their contributions to our family story even as we acknowledge they failed as we have and will, but they're still part of our story, and we still remember them. I think it's also good to remember that the Christian movement started by meeting in people's homes, and when the group got a little larger than that, they met in public buildings before they moved to what became dedicated buildings and set aside church structures. Those set aside church structures were very simple places to meet at first. What they wanted to do was share a common meal. Eating together was very important in the early church. And they would usually end the common meal with the observance of the Lord's Supper. They would read the scriptures. Someone would talk about the scriptures and what that meant for their own lives. And they always gathered gifts for others, for widows, for orphans, for the homeless, for the strangers, and for the immigrants. No gathering was complete without remembering others. I don't know about you, but I am sometimes embarrassed by the opulence of some of our more classic church buildings, having just come back from Europe, and again seeing some of those magnificent buildings. One can wonder who's being glorified. Is it God, or is it the ones who have built this in God's name and wanted to outdo the town next to them as to how high the spire would be, how wide the nave would be, and how many relics they could gather? And the good news story, our story, includes the establishment of places of human relief. It was Christians who started hospitals, places where people could come to escape either the ravages of war or diseases, extending the ministry of Jesus, the great healer, into communities where people's needs, medical needs, spiritual needs could be met. I think it's also interesting to note that our evangelical ancestors, evangelical part of this church's story, when they moved into the greater St. Louis area, were the first ones to establish homes to care for the mentally impaired, for people with significant birth defects, who were the throwaways of society in most cases, confined to closets, forgotten. But the church said, no, these two are children of God, and we will establish safe places, St. Charles, Missouri, for the care of these, the least of God's children. More recently, we have moved not only for homes for mentally challenged people, but homes for children and for orphans, and in some cases for unwed mothers. And then homes for the aged. The Altenheim on the south side of town being one of those, but there are many others sprinkled along this country. In the year 1806, 211 years ago, there were 5 young men who were students at Williams College in western Massachusetts who sought refuge under a haystack during a thunderstorm. And as they waited out the storm, and as they prayed together, they decided that they were going to serve God by becoming missionaries, overseas missionaries. And some of those 5 went to India, and some of those 5 went to the Sandwich Islands, Hawaii. And if you go to Hawaii today, you will find many United Church of Christ congregations started by those students at Williams College, waiting out a thunderstorm saying, God, what do you want to do with my life? Well, friends, we are part of that wonderful story. These are just vignettes of that story. Your individual family tree and my individual family tree and all of our stories together paint a grand canvas. Jesus of Nazareth is our common family ancestor, and the family tree includes Peter and Paul and Lydia and Augustine and John Huss and Martin Luther, the deaconess sisters who started those hospitals, the Altenheim, Williams College graduates in Hawaii and India, and so many, many others. There are some who would say that St. John United Church of Christ Cumberland is 162 years old. And it's true that we were founded by families with names like Backemeyer, Brinkman, Carr, Koch, Cruz, Koenig, Lubking, Meyer, Musing, Nolting, Rodenbeck, Wessling. So true, in a sense, we are 162 years old, this congregation. But no, we are at least 2,000 years old. For those German folks who founded this congregation are just a later chapter of the ongoing story of God's great good news, which happened in all kinds of places all over the world. And we in our time are part of that story, our roots going back to the very beginning of the stirrings of civilization on this good earth. Countless nameless saints have brought us to this time and place. And now our ever-hovering, ever-present God invites us to get caught up in this drama, to feel it, to live our way into it. God's great, grand, good news story. And so every week we will seek to live more fully our way into this rich heritage, claiming it as our own. And every day we will be amazed that we have our own place in God's effort to love this world into God's goodness, that all may know that they are loved. One of God's children, as we are as well. Amen.